Alrighty, this is the audio for Chapter 14, Reading and Writing in Social Research. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about reading and evaluating prior research, designing research and preparing a proposal, wow, outlining and preparing to write, major sections of your research report, and revisions and other writing considerations. Okay, so obviously you want to review the literature by identifying relevant articles and books. So in order to do that, you typically read abstracts to judge the relevance of articles and skim introductory and concluding chapters of books, right? This is going to give you the information to see, what was their research question, what were their results, right? Things like that. Also, it's very important to keep a record of your references. So what I tend to do is, when I'm doing a research study, I will make a Google Doc of just all of the different research I think I'm working with. I'll literally cut and paste in there an abstract. I'll write about a one-sentence kind of summary of what I think the article is talking about, and then I'll put like a one-word label on it to say this is where it should go in my paper. But at the same time, what I do is I will cite them, because typically I use ASA format. So I'll cite them in ASA format in that same list so that later I can just cut and paste that into my reference page and be done. But it's important to keep track of this. I know for most papers like the one for this class, it's pretty easy to keep track of a small amount of references, but the more complex the research papers you do, the more references and the more it can be complicated. I remember one of the drafts of my thesis having a few, I don't even know how many articles. I had 10 plus pages of just reference. So if, there were some things that my advisor found in the reference page that weren't in the paper anymore because they'd been edited out of the paper, or things that were in the paper that weren't cited in the reference page. Those are those kind of things that you have to keep track of. So that's why I create those kind of Google Docs to maintain that information for me, so I can make sure, okay, if I include this in my paper, I'm going to include it in that document so I have it all clear, right? Because you have to reference where you got the information from, otherwise it's considered plagiarism, right? Also, you need to evaluate the credibility of each reference. So meaning, is the article a peer-reviewed journal article? Is it a book from a university press, right? Something that has been peer-reviewed or actually checked. So this is very important. You have to make sure that the information you're actually sourcing is valid and correct itself. If it's just some random thing or a CBS poll or some crap like that that isn't independently verified, then you might be basing a lot of your maybe your theory or your paper's ideas on things that aren't actually peer-reviewed or valid, right? So that's obviously going to create a problem. So you have to basically figure out the credibility of the reference. Was someone paid to create that research, right? We have that whole thing with climate change or global warming, where they say, oh, the science is divided, the scientists haven't concluded, which is complete BS. It's actually, there's been, Koch brothers and other networks like their Kochtopus is what it's called, have been funding fake climate denial science for 20 years. And the idea is that if you can pay someone, 10 grand to write a paper saying climate change isn't going to be that big of a deal because these are oil industry people that want to keep making oil industry money, then, obviously the research itself is looking for a certain conclusion, therefore it's not actually valid research, right? So it's important to really think of, is this a peer-reviewed journal article, right? Is it something where another, organization has to independently verify? Is it something that has validity because maybe it's a, organization like Pew Research Center or something else that has that kind of validity to it? And really, how do you make sure that it's not something that's just biased because, the person who made it was paid 10 grand by the Koch brothers, right? So also we have to look at how a study contributed to the research on the topic. So it's not just enough to say, okay, this research study found this, move on, next paragraph, right? You have to really think about, when you're looking for context of a literature review, the whole idea is you have to figure out what's already out there, what's already been done, so you can place your research within the context of that, right? So when evaluating research questions, key questions to ask are, what is the research question or hypothesis? So when you're looking through, look for specifically, what is their question? What are they hypothesizing they think the relationships are between those variables, right? Which general methodological approach are they taking, right? Which way do they look at the research? And really, how do they decide to measure or, potentially just even operationalize those variables? How do they measure them? How are they going to interpret that data? All of that, right? What's their methodological approach? For quantitative research, what are the key variables, right? What are the relationships that they assume? Do they assume there's going to be, positive correlations, negative correlations, right? How are they being measured, right? Is it a Likert scale? Is it something existing data? Like all of those things you should be looking at when you're evaluating research to see if it's something that's valid to help out your own study. So what's the unit of analysis? How many units are selected, right? So how are you picking who's in the research? How are you picking? That's another thing we'll get to right here too. But what is the unit of analysis that you're measuring, right? What is it that you're trying to actually find? What evidence is reported regarding the quality of the data, right? That's another one. When they talk about this in the write-up section, which we'll talk about in a minute, typically they'll talk about, internal and external validity, internal, external reliability, those kind of things to see whether or not the evidence that they found is actually a good fit. Meaning, depending, every methodology we've talked about has strengths and weaknesses. So there may be a weakness inherent in the methodology that causes a certain, relationship to the quality of the data. What statistics and programs are used to analyze the data? So it's not enough to just say, like, I'm going to use stats, right? You have to say, okay, well, are you going to use something like SPSS as a program that, you basically use as a way to do the more complex mathematical equations because you're like, no, I'm just going to do them all by hand in a notebook and take the rest of my life, right? Actually, it wouldn't take the rest of life. It would just be boring as hell. But we have these programs to be able to do large-scale statistical analyses relatively quickly and give you results in a pretty easily digestible format that you can then turn into tables, figures, charts, all that kind of fun stuff, histograms, to represent the nature of either your sample, your population, the data that you found, all that fun stuff. It's all going to be put through some sort of statistical, mumbo jumbo. For qualitative studies, what form of analysis is applied, right? How are you actually going to analyze what you're looking at? Like if it's a content analysis, how do you determine what sources you're going to use? How many from each source? How long a period of time you're going to measure? All of that kind of stuff. And it's all related to your question or what you're looking at as to what best fits the scope. I mean, honestly, when it comes to this stuff, sometimes it's not really a right or wrong issue. It's just an issue of what's the best outcome you can hope for within the confines of, how much time you have to do it, or just the limitations of that kind of process. And then the last part is what substantive conclusions are drawn from the study. So you're looking through research, what did they find? What conclusion did they make? Was their hypothesis supported? Was it not? Right? Oftentimes in the conclusion, you also see them talk about what future research should be done. And this can help you kind of frame what you think you should be doing in your own approach to the research topic. So when it comes to designing research and preparing a proposal, research questions often fill in a gap in the literature. So you're trying to kind of answer something that you couldn't really answer by looking at other people's research, right? You're going to have to figure out a way to measure it yourself. And sometimes it's not a matter of it hasn't ever been studied before. It's just a matter of maybe your particular population hasn't been studied before. So let's say you were looking at studies that had, already taken place on a particular topic, and then you say, well, how is this affecting the Cal State Fullerton student community or something of that nature, right? So you're basically looking at it in, a different approach, basically, right? You're going to fill in the gaps as to how it applies to that particular population. So beginning researchers may want to replicate studies while making small changes, right? So this could be maybe in a qualitative sense, using different theories to interpret the results that you see, as a lot of that stuff is pretty subjective as to how it's interpreted. In more quantitative statistical analyses, this could be making small changes in what variables you're measuring or in the specific outcomes that you're looking at or your proposed hypotheses, right? So that you can basically, you're reevaluating some conclusions that have been made, but you're taking a different spin on it. So let's say you were looking at, okay, this was an inequality that was found statistically significant between men and women. Let's see if that's true for, a variable of like sexuality. Does it affect that as well, right? Something like that. So research proposals describe the research design or how the research will, or the questions themselves will be addressed. So this may be submitted in requests for funding, right? Obviously the proposal itself, that's why you have to do one for this class, because it's like an essential thing you have to learn that's just a step in the research process, right? Oftentimes if you're in graduate school, you're doing a thesis, you got to turn in your proposal. If you're doing research independently, or if you're working with, a professor or a research team doing research, you're going to need a proposal. And typically, you're going to be required by IRB to submit this stuff. We talked about IRB in the past, but IRB is just going to make sure that there's nothing ethically dubious in your research, right? Or that there's kind of considerations for limiting any potential harm that could happen for participants participating in your research, right? So writing it. Before you write, obviously you create an outline, something I forced you to do in this class of the report, right? And you use articles as your model of organization for how to do this. And you kind of get your basis of what you're looking at from there. So some of the writing tips to overcome writer's block that we kind of discussed earlier in the class were free writing. This is a big one. I call it the brain dump, where you just quickly record your thoughts without regard for grammar, without reference to your notes or other information. You just kind of dump out everything that's running around in your brain working on, so that you can then, later sift through that and find those kind of, pieces of it that are gold that you can then put into your, basic outline for your proposal, right? So typically the best way to do this is to treat the first draft as one of a series of drafts. For me personally, I teach the writing course, talk about it in that class a lot, but I've personally suffered from writer's block quite a bit. And it's frustrating as hell. Or I'm just like a professional procrastinator. Like when I really have to do something, I can like clean the entire house or do some, KonMari method all over my house because, I'm just trying to avoid doing the thing I have to do. So, and a lot of that has to do with looking at a project as the full scope of it, instead of looking at it as something you can break down into parts. Meaning, if you just treat the first draft as a draft, then it removes all that emotional connection of it being done for you. And I think a lot of this has to do with the way that we teach all of these kind of aspects in college, is this idea that somehow it's just easy to everyone else but not for you. Everyone just writes like a draft and they're done. But that's all BS. Good writing is rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. It's just like ad nauseum, right? So the first draft is just a draft. Then you go back, you fix it up, do another draft. Go back, fix it up, do another draft. And oftentimes, even if you're only spending 20, 30 minutes at a time doing this, you're going to get so much more work done than if you just sit down for like 5 hours before it's due and try and pump it out. Also, it's important to write for a lay audience. Even though sometimes you're just turning this stuff into professors and they know what you're talking about, you still have to write it in a way that actually explains what you're encountering. So if you have a variable and you're defining it, or if you have certain theories you're using, you have to give examples and illustrations and kind of provide explanations as if the person reading it doesn't know, right? Because we want sociology to be accessible. We don't want it to be something that's only for the most elite or people that have been in, upper division or graduate programs. We want it to be accessible, right? So actually in my writing class, the sample that I love to use is one that my student had her, there's these two girls that she babysat. I think the oldest was like 12 and the other was like 10. And she actually had them read her paper. And even though it's very rigorous and very academically, has all the stuff in there, the bells and whistles, it still has a clarity to the paper because it's not written so confusing that a 12-year-old can't get the sense of what these sociological concepts mean, right? So you want to write it for everybody, because ultimately if we want what we talk about in these social classes, and really what we study as social phenomenon, if we are looking at inequalities or people that are marginalized or different groups that don't have the same access, then we want anyone to be able to take that information and provide social change, whether it's activism, whether it's laws, whatever it might be, to try to, provide that information to a larger audience than just people who like read sociology journals for fun, which is no one. Active voice. Use active voice. Oh my God. All day, please use active voice. Active voice is, when you actually write something that's quick, to the point, concise. You don't do like, furthermore, in regards to this, in many ways, there could be contributed, blah, blah, blah. Instead of just saying, like, this is what I found, or this is what relationship I'm looking at, and being straightforward. And what's important about active voice is that it's all about the subject that's doing the action, not the action itself. Right? So sometimes passive voice makes sense when you're like trying to focus on the subject of the sentence, but active voice focuses on the actual doer, right? So to say something like, oh my God, this is a terrible example, but it's for my writing class. It's one of the worksheets they have to do. And the example I gave them, which is like not subtle and is much more about the fact that Adam feeds the cats much more than I do. Adam being the fiance, that one of them was Adam fed the cat, which is active voice. And passive voice for the same thing would be the cat was fed by Adam. Right? So again, it just matters on what you're trying to focus on. If I'm focusing on the cat, then it makes more sense to do passive. But in a lot of these situations, we're talking about research, we can get kind of lost in the weeds of it, or we can get lost in more of the arguments or the theories and forget we're talking about human people. So we want to put them in the driver's seat. We want to use active voice so that we focus on them, right? And of course, proper grammar, punctuation, and style must be important, because otherwise the paper is boring, it doesn't make sense, it lacks the clarity, and you want to make sure that you're conveying the argument you think you're conveying, right? So all of these things are important, and really being concise. Like, why have a bunch of extra words in there you don't need? Because it just slows down the flow and it makes it much more muddled what you're trying to say. So when it comes to parts of a research report, you got the introduction. This answers the question, why should I care? Right? And so this is supposed to kind of get people interested in the overall paper. It indicates the theoretical relevance and social practical significance of the research question. So that's obviously very important. And so that's why you should end the introduction section with your clearly stated research question that's going to kind of lead the analysis through the entire paper. In the literature review section, this is where you should provide a selective but fair treatment of research on the topic. Selective but fair, meaning you don't include every research study in the history of time, but you include enough of them that there's a pretty good summary of what the overall arguments are. You're not just cherry picking or kind of excluding things that are main arguments from that particular discipline or topic, right? Also, it should show how the research question or hypothesis follows from previous research, meaning it's not coming out of left field. It's based on previous studies that have found interesting relationships, and that you're kind of moving from that platform more towards your specific research, right? You're not starting from square one. You're not, kind of reinventing the wheel or kind of creating research in a void, that you're building upon research, which is an important part of, sociological, all of it really, is to try and build upon what we know from the past and, change those things, look at things a little bit differently as we move into the future. Okay, so some more parts of a research report. You got your methods section. This states the general methodological approach and its principal design features. So this is basically where you're going to lay out, like, who's your sample, who's your population, why'd you pick them, how well does it represent, right? What kind of approach are you taking? What kind of steps are you doing to collect the data, to analyze the data? All that just real fun stuff, right? Who participated, meaning, again, your population, your sample. How would you select your sample? Oh, I did snowball sampling. Boom. That's how you selected them, right? So the whole point of the methods, you're trying to describe exactly how you carried out the research. So this is, again, important, because if we're talking about the majority of early research, or they said beginning researchers, use replication as a method of doing research, your methods has to lay out exactly how you did it, how you measured it. Like, for example, we talked about that before, the example of if you're trying to see, does eating breakfast impact or improve a student's, aptitude in class, something like that, then how do you operationalize or measure the things that you're looking at? So, for example, how do you operationalize breakfast? What does that mean? How do you then measure it? Are you going to give them a survey? Are you going to go to their house and watch them eat breakfast? Like, you know what I mean? I mean, obviously, I know I'm getting a little off the rails with it, but what I mean there is, you have to be very specific about how you actually are going to carry out all these things and be very thoughtful about how you gain the data, how you analyze the data, so that it's pretty clear. And then really what limitations exist that can affect what kind of results you find, right? Then you get to your findings and results. So this is the part you don't have to do for the paper, right? Yay. Because you're not actually doing the research, you can't do this part. But it's so important that we talk about why, how this works, and you learn about the basics of it. So the findings and the results indicate what statistical analyses were performed, if they were performed, right? This is where you're going to put all those fun tables and figures, right, that summarize large amounts of information. So for example, you'll have your descriptive statistics that are going to tell you, like, okay, this is how many people participated in the study, and here's the composition of that population, etc., right, or of that sample. Then you're also going to have some of the tables and figures that, again, just kind of look at what the overall, relationships were, right? And this is organized around your major questions and findings. So for something like your, qualitative research, this would be where you're actually looking at some of the coding you've done, right? Where you're outlining, let's say, what the general patterns were. And then in your discussion section, you would then provide a way to interpret that, right? Just as you would with the quantitative paper, you're going to summarize your major findings and interpret your results, but you're going to interpret the results of the statistical analyses, right? So, that's going to, again, provide major summary of your findings. It's going to point out strengths and weaknesses of the results of that, right? You're also going to conclude with a succinct statement about, the major points of the study to try and remind people why they should give a crap about reading that long-ass paper, right? And then, of course, you want to make sure your references are in accordance with whatever's the expectation. So ASA is pretty much expected for all the sociological peer-reviewed journals, which is why I forced you to do it in this class, is, or just to have to learn it for like 5 seconds, is because, that's something that's another one of those key parts that you have to make sure you've done correctly before you can submit, your manuscript to somebody. All right. Revision, length, and avoiding plagiarism. Ugh. So the purpose of the first draft is to transfer your ideas from your mind to the page or screen. So the final report should be the product of multiple drafts. Like we talked about before, you draft, you draft, you draft. It's best to take a little time between drafts so you have enough time for your brain to reflect. It's an interesting phenomenon that your brain is working on these things while you're not paying attention, right? So all the while, it's kind of working through some of the problems or maybe some of the wording or issues in your paper. So when you give yourself time in between drafts, you come and look at it, you have fresh eyes, right? You see it a little bit differently. And it's also good to ask other people to read your work, right? That's why I encourage you within the class to use the writing tutor, to use, the sociology writing tutor, to go to the ULC. Any of those kind of things are really one of my favorite things to do. Force your loved ones. Coerce your loved ones, right? I mean, my significant other, he doesn't necessarily want to read my research that much, for sure. Like, I don't see like an incredible optimism for it, but he's really good at finding the stuff I'm not, like a comma error or, like little grammatical and sentence structure issues that I might have overpassed. Because remember, you're so in it, you're so focused on the paper that it's hard to see past your own nose sometimes when it comes to that stuff, right? Like, you're just so in it that, you're able to kind of sometimes look past some of those things, or you feel like that part's explained well, but then when you give it to someone else, they're like, what do you mean by this? Or they can point out those parts that you're like, well, I thought that was clear, but it's not to someone else. So oftentimes having someone else look at it is so incredibly important because they can see the things in it that we can't see because they're looking at it with extremely fresh eyes, right? So the length of a report is a poor measure of the quality, meaning just because something's long doesn't mean it's good, right? I'm sure all of you have had at some point in your college career had to extend the length of a paper because it didn't meet the requirements. And what'd you do? What did you do to extend that paper? Did you rigorously do more research? No, you just BS'd it, right? You threw in a couple more paragraphs, or you walked a circular argument around that bad boy like 4 more times, so you had that extra half a page you needed so you could finish. So again, for me personally, I care so much less about the length of something than the content in it, because I understand that a lot of people write differently, right? Meaning, I write like I talk, I go on for goddamn forever, right? Versus some people are extremely succinct. So they're just going to, like my dad's one of those people. He doesn't talk much, but when he does, it's important, right? Like he's going to tell you just what you need to know. And his writing's a reflection of that, right? It's going to be pretty straightforward. So if we're writing on the same topic with the same requirements, my paper might be, maybe his paper might be a third of mine, right? But as long as it's hit the requirements for an assignment, if I'm the person grading it, I'm happy, right? It just means different people write differently. And the problem with our education system is we amalgamate a standard for everybody, right? We say, oh, okay, it's got to be 10 pages or something like that. For some people, getting it under 10 pages is difficult because the way they like to describe it, they like to flourish it, or like I do, go on and on. So it goes on a bit, right? And that doesn't mean it has to be bad. Sometimes it can just take a better, if you're using that space effectively to give illustrations or make clear points, those things can be effective. But sometimes the brevity or the, being concise can actually just be much more effective. But some people just have that kind of writing style, right? More so than others. So just making it longer, being like, oh, wow, it's 100 pages instead of 80 pages doesn't make it a better research, or it's 12 pages instead of 5, doesn't necessarily make it better research. It matters depending on the context of what you're writing about and what you need to explore, how long something should be, right? So the problem though is that we tend to think of it that way. We tend to think of it like, well, this one's longer, so this one must be much more robust. And as we know, we've all had that paper, that one class that they wanted a requirement that was super long. So we just kind of BS'd a couple paragraphs and put it in there. Didn't make it better, right? Sometimes that paper is better without those paragraphs. So I always encourage students, hey, if your paper's a little shorter than the requirement, a little longer than the requirement, fine. I just think you have to have some standard, because you can't say like you can turn in 1 page and another student turns in a 15-page paper and somehow that's the same, because it's not. But at the same time, some people are very concise, so maybe in 5 or 6 pages, they can do the same that someone else can do in 10, right? Also, it's incredibly important to avoid plagiarism. So plagiarism is one of those things that it's not just important from, a kind of ethical standpoint. I mean, it obviously is. But I mean, the consequences for this, especially in the realms of academia, are really, really impactful, right? Meaning, you can have consequences of, marks on your record that talk about plagiarism. You can actually be kicked out of school, and then getting back into school is pretty much impossible when it says cheater on your transcripts, right? Because that's what it does. So plagiarism is just when you put others' words into, basically you just don't give them credit for their words. So sometimes this could be just using their words as your own, like not putting them in quotes. It could be when you're paraphrasing or summarizing that you're just, oh man, this is when we talk about my writing class. Sometimes people will take a sentence and they'll just change like 3 or 4 of the words by like highlighting it in Word and changing it to a synonym. But that's still plagiarism, because you're not actually like interpreting what they're saying. So let's say it this way. Let's say that I said to you, okay, the car is blue, right? Then if you plagiarize, like if you're just taking that and trying to turn in your own words without kind of explaining it or synthesizing it, it's easy to say like the automobile was, blue in color or something like that. That you're still using the same structure, the same format. You're not actually explaining why does that matter and how does that connect to your research or your topic, right? That's ultimately what we're really looking at when we look at articles, right? We're not trying to just put those findings, oftentimes people over rely on quotes because they don't feel comfortable explaining what the research is saying. So I had a friend of mine that was particularly has an issue with this. And when he was working on his thesis in grad school, I remember being an idiot and helping him for like no pay and no reason, just because I'm a pal, I guess. But I helped him for a lot of hours, and he would just get really frustrated and say, like, I just don't know how to describe this. And I'd be like, okay, well, say it to me. Oh, well, at-risk youth face additional issues because of blank. Cool, write that. And he'd be like, no, it's got to be more complicated than that. I'm like, it doesn't. It really doesn't. You can just explain it the way you would explain it to a friend, just without the curse words and the slang, right? So just make it, sometimes it's more simple than we think, right? So it's important to use our own voice and avoid that plagiarism, because oftentimes with plagiarism, we're just taking other people's ideas and putting them in our mouth when they're not our ideas, when it's actually much better to be able to summarize, hey, what was that person saying, and say, hey, according to this person, this is the argument, right? And like I said, it's a problem when we over-rely on quotations, because sometimes it takes you out of the paper. It kind of goes from one language to another. Each one of our word structure is different. So it just kind of like, it can be confusing. And especially in research papers, what's incredibly important to do is to recontextualize that quotation. Meaning, why should we care, right? Or explain, what is that quote actually trying to say? How is that related to your paper, right? If we just kind of have a quote that says, okay, 40% of people that face the issue I'm looking at experience blank. And then you just move on to the next thing and you're like, cool, what am I supposed to take away from that? You have to be driving this bus, right, of your paper. You have to be in the driver's seat to be able to kind of steer and navigate the analysis in your paper, the argument in your paper, right? So part of this kind of issue with plagiarism is really just a confidence in your own words and your own perspective in your interpretation of what you're seeing in the research, right? So you want to cite original sources is the last thing I'll kind of hammer on there too. Oh, this one kills me, but it happens pretty much anytime I teach a research methods or writing class, because I feel like we don't educate folks early on in college to really kind of differentiate these things, or some of these things that we should know in basically high school, right? That you have to cite the original. Meaning, let's say you're looking through a research study and they're quoting another research study. Because fun fact, every research study has a lit review. So if you look at someone else's lit review, it's like looking at someone else's work, right? They already researched all that stuff, but those aren't their findings, right? So let's say that 40% of people that face your issue experience blank is something that they found in a different research study. You can't say, researcher 1 read a book that I didn't read about researcher 2, and researcher 2 said, according to researcher 1, that blank. Because that's not, but here's a really incredibly easy way to get around that, because that's considered plagiarism. You're just literally like cutting and pasting someone else's lit review into your lit review. Here's the easiest way to deal with that. You find something interesting and you're like, oh, that would be valuable for me to put in my research. Just go to their reference page. Just go to the reference page, find the article that's the original one, and go look through that bad boy, because then you're going to be able to cite it directly, right? I mean, it's a super easy fix. A lot of times people don't even think about that, but you have to cite it from their results, right? Their discussion, results, conclusion. That's what you're supposed to be citing. You're not supposed to be citing their lit review, because that's not their research. That's their study of what other people did. Their actual research is what they have in the findings in the discussion conclusion, right? That's where you're going to find what they found in their research. Does that make sense? So basically, it's kind of weird when you're like saying, this researcher says this other researcher says, because that's not direct, right? And that's considered plagiarism. So you have to make sure you're citing directly so that the findings that you're talking about come from that particular research that you're looking at, right? And that's a big one that I see kind of go under the radar of plagiarism that people often don't even understand, or even the idea that you can plagiarize yourself, right? Like, you have to do these assignments for these classes, right? And sometimes we have certain topics that we're interested in, so there are ways in which you can kind of build upon a previous paper. Like, let's say you have a paper from your 308 class that you want to use in a 302 class, right? Cool. You can adapt it and you can rework it to fit the requirements of the 302 class. But that doesn't mean you just use the same paper and are lazy and don't actually change anything, because that's just plagiarism, right? The idea that You're using something from a previous class or previous assignment and then just turning that in as is, right? Especially when a lot of these classes, like our 308 class, the whole point is to write a paper, right? So, anywho, it's still considered plagiarism because it's already been submitted for another purpose. But like I said, there's a certain amount of overlap that's allowed. Like I have a student that the one I was saying I use as an example in 308. At the same semester she was in my 308, she was also in I believe a 381 course, which is sexualities, and my 356 course, inequalities. So I have a paper component in each class, and she wrote 3 different versions of that paper, basically, right? Meaning she adapted, her argument was about, for the main one, for 308, it was about Disney and gender representations and how that affects developing minds of children, like how it socializes them about rigid gender roles. And then in my sexualities course, she talked about that in relation to sexuality and heteronormativity. And then in my inequalities course, she looked at racial and ethnic representations within Disney films. So there's some amount of it that overlaps, right? The media part, the part about Disney being a cultural influence, blah, blah, blah. And eventually she did go on to grad school overseas or in Scotland, I believe. Yeah, that's right. Super rad. But anyway, she's a cool person. And she was able to kind of put the 3 together as the basis of her then what developed into a longer research project and paper, right? So, there are ways, if you're interested in a particular topic and you've already written about it, there's ways to incorporate that information. But remember, you can't just like cut and paste a paper from a previous thing, as much as that would save all the time, right? And I understand the time constraints of college, right? And the pressures that people face to try to, pay for school, get through school, and actually get all these assignments done, right? So if you have an interest, that's fine. You can still use some of that information. But the idea is you should be creating a unique thing for each new project, right? You can't just cut and paste the same thing. Even if it's your own work, it's still considered plagiarism. But I feel like a lot of students have never heard that. So I was trying to include that just to give you some more information so you can protect yourself, because if you get a plagiarism ding on your record, which can be very, very, problematic for you academically, you should at least know why it's happening, right? Or have the warning ahead of time to understand that could be a consequence, right? So plagiarism is just really important because we want to make sure, like, if you are going to go through the work to do all of this research and all of this stuff and get the results and get the findings, that someone isn't just going to take that from you, put it in their own words, or basically not put it in their own words, just take your words and pretend they are their words. Don't use quotes or anything of that nature. It's basically stealing, right? You're like stealing someone's intellectual baby, right? It takes them a lot of time and effort to create this stuff. So it's not just disrespectful, but it's very difficult because basically in academia, you trade in thought, in argument, in theory. So you're basically kind of taking something for free, right? So plagiarism is very important because we get our ideas from somewhere. And we have to basically atone for that to say, okay, here's the information I'm using from, researcher X, Y, or Z, and here's what I'm arguing. And it's important to make clear, what is your voice? Where does their voice end? Where does your voice begin? Because that improves incredibly the clarity of your arguments in your paper, right? You're saying, okay, well, the research finds this, and this is important to my argument because blank, or I'm interested in this finding particularly because of the relationship between these variables, which I'm studying, or whatever it is, you want to always bring it back to you. You're in the driver's seat, you're leading it. So plagiarism gets in the way of that, right? It really does, at the most egregious points of just cutting and pasting from someone else, it's literally stealing. But sometimes plagiarism is just more like sloppy or lazy citations that just aren't done correctly and can still have those consequences which you just don't want to face, right?